It is my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Dr. Thant Myint-U. Dr. Thant was born into a very distinguished Burmese family. His ancestors served the King of Burma in the court of Ava in the 18th century and in the court of Mandalay in the 19th century. His grandfather was the Secretary General of the United Nations, U Thant, and as a result, Dr. Thant was born in New York City in 1966. He went on to study at Harvard, then got a master's degree at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and finally, in 1996, earned his doctorate at the University of Cambridge in the UK. Dr. Thant has written 4 books on Myanmar history over the years, each with a different perspective. And his latest book, which is on sale here, came out recently. And in it, he combines the authority of somebody who has personally been involved in and witnessed the events of Myanmar's recent history with the training of a rigorous historian who brings an academic perspective to the events he describes. But what he manages to do, since he knows all of the players in recent Myanmar history, is bring the story very much to life, and he provides in a fascinating way an understanding of the nuances and complexities of what Myanmar is all about today and how it became this way over the last 150 years of its history. And this is, I think, a very useful perspective, a correction to the sometimes oversimplified narratives of recent Myanmar events that are so often provided by Western observers. So it's a great pleasure this evening to invite Dr. Thant to speak with us. Please welcome our speaker.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor for me to be here. I think it's the 3rd time that I've spoken at the Siam Society. The last was when my last book came out 7 or 8 years ago, and I'm very grateful to the chair for his kind introduction. One thing that he left out was to say that, you know, I lived in Bangkok, very close to where we are today, when I was a teenager, from when I was 12 years old to 17, or 13 to 17, in the very late 1970s, early 1980s, and I was a frequent visitor to the Siam Society then. So it's a particular pleasure for me to be here with you this evening. I think when I talk about my book, I think the best way to sort of describe it, and I'd like to leave some time for questions if you have as well, is to tell you a little bit about, you know, why I wrote the book and how it evolved in different ways. I first thought of writing this book back in 2015, and when I first thought of writing the book, I thought it was going to be more or less a straightforward political history of the past 10 years, the transition from dictatorship to democracy, from the time of the military junta in the mid-2000s through the democratic elections of 2015 and the coming to power of the National League for Democracy and Aung San Suu Kyi. And I had been involved in and out in sort of Burmese politics in different ways for a long time. In 1988, I graduated from Harvard, as was mentioned, and I was interning in Geneva for an NGO related to the UN. And that's when the big pro-democracy demonstrations, uprising broke out in Yangon, or in Rangoon at the time. And I was really keen to try to be a part of that. I was 22 at the time. I felt I was missing out on what seemed like was going to be an exciting revolution, a pro-democracy revolution. And so I quit my internship. I flew to Bangkok, and I got ready to go into to Rangoon. My parents were actually living in Bangkok at the time. And the very morning that I was supposed to fly in from Don Mueang Airport to Rangoon's Mingladon Airport, the airport on that side was shut down by the general strike, and so I was stuck here and couldn't be part of what I thought was still going to be a successful revolution. But within a couple of weeks, a trickle of students, 4 students first, one of whom became the founder of the Democratic Voice of Burma, showed up at our door. We were living at Taiping Towers on Ekamai at the time, and said the military is going to crack down. This is what we think. We need arms. We need to set up a student army at the border. And those first few students became 20 students, then 50 students, then 1,000. We were helped by Thai students at Ramkhamhaeng University and elsewhere to hide many of these students in different safe houses in Bangkok. Eventually 10,000 arrived at the border by Christmas of that year and set up a number of different camps, and they set up their army, the All Burma Students Democratic Front, which actually still survives to this day. So my first kind of immersion into Burmese politics was the year I spent with them here in Bangkok, and then also at these camps along the border, from all the way down opposite Prachuap all the way north to areas opposite Mae Hong Son. And I went from there to Washington. I took up a master's. I was supposed to be doing a master's full-time at Johns Hopkins SAIS in Washington, D.C., but actually spent that entire time, except for the classes that I had to take to pass, trying to sort of mobilize opinion against the military government at the time. I set up the first Burma advocacy group there in Washington. There was a small band of people on the Hill, staffers of different congressmen, senators like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who were interested. And we were campaigning basically for the hardest line approach possible against the Burmese generals. And I was for any kind of sanction, any kind of measure that would revenge what we all saw as an incredibly unjust set of events that had taken place with the uprising being crushed in 1988 and its aftermath. And by 1990, we had elections, but these election results were not they were recognized, but they were not respected. Aung San Suu Kyi won a Nobel Prize and shot to international fame. And we all wanted to support the democracy movement as much as possible. But really by 1993, I had second thoughts. And when we were living in Bangkok in the 80s, we were traveling to Rangoon all the time. And we were there on holidays. We were there for a couple of months every summer. We were there over Christmas and Easter break when I wasn't at ISB down the street here. And it was very clear to me, even then as a child, that a big part of Burma's problem was its isolation. And inasmuch as I had wanted to see the end of military rule, and we were really angry about what the army had done in crushing democratic dissent in 88 and 89 and 90, I also really wanted the country to come out of that isolation. And so sanctions didn't really make much sense to me. And I saw that the new military government at the time, the junta that took over, however brutal it was trying to do things to come out of that isolation. It ended restrictions on tourism, for example, and said it wanted to rejoin the world economy. So I wasn't really sure. I didn't like the government at the time, but I was pretty unsure about sanctions. So I left the whole political scene and didn't do anything in Burmese politics for a very long time. I went into academia. I wrote my PhD. I worked on 19th century Burmese history. I was part of different UN peacekeeping operations, and then I worked at the UN in New York for 7 years, not on Myanmar, but on other countries. And then in 2007, after I had worked on UN reform under Kofi Annan for a couple of years and thinking that wasn't really going to lead anywhere very quickly, I quit the UN 2006, 2007 and thought I might at least try to come back and see what was possible in Myanmar. And I'd been away. I mean, I'd visited on holiday, been there for a week over Christmas, but I didn't really know the country very well. But what I was increasingly certain of, from what I had read and what I had seen, even over my short visits, was how poor the country had become in comparison with pretty much every other country in the region, and really the depth and the scale of humanitarian deprivation in the country, the absolute need for more international aid, and the way in which the politics around democracy reform had made assistance to the most vulnerable people in the country more difficult. So that I felt I was quite clear of in my mind. And so when we came back, I was based in Bangkok at the time, but going into Myanmar quite frequently in 2007, 8. For those of you who are here, you might remember that was the time of the monks' protests that were crushed violently. It was also the time of Cyclone Nargis, which killed 140,000 people in a single night, and many of those people even still now haven't had the assistance to recover their lives. And so for a few years I worked with different people internationally and Myanmar people to try to improve international aid access, to negotiate more aid programs into the country. The generals were very paranoid, the generals were very isolated. It took me a couple of years to just meet my first general and to have a normal conversation with him and to try to convince him that it was in everyone's interest to allow in more international assistance. But it meant also trying to convince people on the outside that international assistance might be possible and might reach the people who were most in need. And in doing that, in those years, I got to know other sort of like-minded Burmese people, people who didn't like the regime, who wanted to see change, but who also wanted to put the situation of ordinary people and poor people first, and who were instinctively by that time against increasing economic sanctions or tighter economic sanctions and aid cutoffs against the country. And so that's the kind of background in terms of what happened to me in 2011, because all of a sudden, all these doors that had been slammed shut or seemed to be shut suddenly swung wide open. And outside, as you probably remember, very few people thought that anything was ever going to change in Myanmar. And people had written off the new constitution, the one that we have now, and the elections in 2011 as really leading to nothing more than a fig leaf for continued military dictatorship. No one expected anything, except for the people that I'd gotten to know in Myanmar at the time, who I think, because they had developed some links with people within the military, because they were negotiating aid access, had a sense, a much clearer sense, that the generals weren't about to kind of give it all up, but they were planning the biggest power shake-up in a generation, and that would be an opportunity. And so what I do in part of my book is to try to describe what happens next. And it wasn't as seen or sometimes portrayed from the outside as this sort of miraculous shift from dark dictatorship to complete democracy. It wasn't the result of Western sanctions and pressure. It wasn't even the result of President Obama's engagement policy at the time. It wasn't because the generals had wanted to pivot away from China and were looking at things geostrategically on a map. It was actually for a whole variety of reasons linked to intra-military and intra-elite politics. And for those of you who read the book, you'll see, really came down to a few specific personalities and very personal motivations within parts of the military elite for wanting to move in the direction that they did. And so when I first started writing the book in 2015, I thought that was the story I wanted to tell. I got to know some of those ex-generals, the ones who had led the reforms in 2011. That included former President Thein Sein, who was then an ex-general. It included a couple of his ministers, like U So Thein and U Aung Min, who headed the peace process, which I worked on. And I interviewed them for about 5, 10, 15 hours. And it was very clear to me that the reasons they did what they did, and what they did, for those of you who may not remember, was they went off script. In 2011, there was a new constitution. It was not a democratic constitution. The army was still autonomous, but there was a little stage created for elected political parties. And in the first instance, the elected political party was basically the party of ex-generals. And so, again, many people didn't expect things to change. But then a few of these guys went way off what was intended in releasing very quickly thousands of political prisoners and freeing up the internet 100%, in ending media censorship and allowing free trade unions to be organized, and a whole slew of different economic measures, and even more importantly, bringing civilians and outside civilians into government for the first time since the military first took over in 1962. These things were completely unexpected and, again, unprecedented in half a century of military dictatorship. If you read the book, you'll have a sense of why they did that, but they did that at exactly the same moment that Washington, under President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, were looking for their own reasons to engage with Myanmar's generals with an eye to China. And so there was an alignment of the stars in the sense that at exactly the moment that Washington was looking for a reason to engage the generals gave Washington just enough scope and reason and justification to justify basically a quick rolling back in 2012 of US and eventually other sanctions as well. So again, part of my book is that political process and really zooming it down to the level of the key 3 or 4 people who I think made a big difference for good and bad reasons and very different reasons at that time. And of course, if you take the story forward, it goes to 2015 and the elections, and then the coming to office of Aung San Suu Kyi, and then the specific instance or the specific context within which she came into office really led to a certain type of government, which was very different than what many people expected. Not the kind of revolutionary, democratic government that some expected inside the country, not the liberal leaning government that many on the international side expected a government led by her to be, but something very different with roots in Burmese nationalism, but much more importantly, I think very much situated into the strange political context that had developed by 2015 in Naypyidaw between the army and different political personalities as well as factions in the country. But when I started writing the book in 2016, a couple of things had already begun to happen which clouded that picture. The first was the peace process, which I had worked on as a special advisor to the government. And the peace process was going nowhere fast by that point. The initial hopes, because there had been a number of ceasefires agreed in 2012 and 2013, that there would be a permanent peace, that basically everything, all good things, democracy and peace were just around the corner, that wasn't going to happen. Instead, there was an outbreak of fighting in the far north of the country, in the Kachin Hills, displacing 100,000 people, leading to thousands dead. And then there was sporadic, but sometimes intense fighting along the Chinese border as well. And the nationwide ceasefire agreement that I had been part of the team that led the government negotiation in drafting with the leaders of ethnic armed organizations, that was only signed by a minority of those groups in 2015. For those of you who don't know, and you look at the map, you can see the Shan Plateau in the east of the country. That's where the bulk of the armed conflict has been over the past few decades. There were ceasefires since the late 1980s, early 1990s, but those are the ceasefires that began to break down in part after 2011. Myanmar is a country of about 20 different ethnic armed organizations. The biggest is the United Wa State Army, which controls areas both on the Chinese and the Thai border. They have over 20,000, perhaps as many as 30,000 well-armed troops with armor and artillery and surface-to-air missiles and a fairly sizable city of their own, Pang Sang. It's really a mini-state about the size of Belgium in the northeast of Myanmar. But alongside these different ethnic armed organizations are hundreds of militia, perhaps as many as 1,000 different militia groups, stretching that entire border from almost Tibet all the way down towards Ranong in the south of Thailand. But that peace process, even though there were initial hopes that this would lead to a permanent peace, again began to go pear-shaped and didn't lead anywhere by 2016. And of course, by 2016, we also had not only the communal violence between Muslims and Buddhists in the western Rakhine State, and then the exodus of thousands of people by boat, again, mostly Muslims, mostly Rohingya Muslims, from Rakhine State to Thailand and Malaysia in 2015. But then in 2016, we saw much more serious violence that led to the exodus of 60,000, 70,000 people into Bangladesh, and that was then followed in 2017 by even more bloodshed, leading to 700,000 people fleeing to Bangladesh in one of the fastest and biggest refugee exoduses since the Second World War anywhere in the world. So because of that, I felt my book couldn't just be this simple political history about why things shifted in 2011 and began to lead towards a more democratic outcome, but really had to think about, why has this been a country with this kind of conflict? What are the roots of this conflict? How does one even begin to think about issues of identity and ethnicity, citizenship and belonging, differences in race and religion and what this has meant? And for that, I couldn't just talk about the last 10 years, and I felt I had to both write a little bit about the deeper history of the country over the past many centuries, and I do that in the very beginning of the book, but also talk about the huge and negative legacies of colonialism. Because if you go back to British times in the late 19th and 20th century, and this is when colonial administrators administered censuses which put people into, or tried to put people into very neat boxes, which categorized people, including the people in Arakan, which is now Rakhine State, asking people, are you sure if you're Muslim or if you're Buddhist, are you really this, are you really that? And those debates around the censuses, putting people into specific ethnic categories, into very rarefied, essentialist categories, is what has shaped the thinking and the discussion and the discourse around race and identity in Burma, in Myanmar, all of these years, including these 70 years since the end of colonial rule. So I talk about the colonial legacy of race, and we have to remember that Burma was not this Burma that you see on the map. This never existed until 1886 or 1887. You had different kingdoms in the Irrawaddy Valley going back 1,000 years or more, but this particular set of boundaries is new. It's a modern colonial creation. And Burma was in the late 19th century born as a British and quite brutal British military occupation. It grew up in the late 19th and early 20th century as a racial hierarchy for the first time, where people's position were based on blood and race. And the British left behind three very clear legacies. The first because of World War II and the Japanese invasion, and we sometimes forget how destructive that invasion was, where pretty much, except for Rangoon, every single town and city in the country was bombed flat. Every economic infrastructure in the country, every road, every rail, every factory, every oil refinery was utterly destroyed. And then the British came back and basically spent a couple of years in Burma and then left in 1948. And left extremely weak institutions. So whereas in India, the civil service had developed to a point where you had hundreds, if not thousands, of well-trained, experienced Indian civil servants, both in India and in Pakistan. In Burma, the number of people who had experience in senior or even middle-level administrative and government functions was extremely few. And so there were very weak institutions, and the British, of course, had ruled on parts of Myanmar, maybe half of Myanmar, only very lightly or indirectly. So in the hills, there had been almost no government, even in the days before World War II. So within a year of the end of British rule, basically everything collapsed into civil war, and this is the civil war that we've had ever since 1948. So weak institutions, a race-based sort of set of identities were two of the legacies. But, the more I thought about writing this book, and I'm just looking to see if I didn't bring my watch, so if someone can tell me when my time is almost up, please let me know. And because I'd like to leave time for questions as well. I think, when I started actually writing this book and trying to figure out how I was going to shape this and make sense of everything, and the more I interviewed people, and I interviewed dozens and dozens of people, and you'll see in the book from people who are extremely poor migrant workers and others to the top generals and businessmen, the more I realized that, even more important than the political history of the country, even more important than the history of ethnicity and race and identity in the country, the thing that has really been shaping people's lives and has animated really Burmese society for these past couple of decades is the history of the political economy in the country. And that is often never really discussed and talked about. And it wasn't really a framework from which I had thought about things, to be honest, 10 or 15 years ago. And I'll tell you what I mean. Could someone just see what time it is right now? Is it 7:30? Okay, good. I'll speak for 15 minutes. I think, when people think about the modern or the recent modern history of Myanmar, 1988 is usually thought of as an inflection point where we had the uprising that I'd mentioned before, elections that were not respected. A couple of years later, NLD was formed, Aung San Suu Kyi won her Nobel Prize. And then the 25 years since then is portrayed as a struggle between dictators and democrats, between the generals and the NLD. And Aung San Suu Kyi has been held up as this democracy icon, especially in the West, and in a similar but different way within the country as well. But I think that, in a way, the even more important inflection point in understanding Myanmar today is what happened a year later in 1989. And that's often not really thought about. In 1989, 4 different things happened at almost exactly the same time. The first is that the new military junta came to power and abolished the old Burmese way to socialism. It ended the socialist system and any pretense at a socialist ideology. Now, up until that point, the left had completely dominated Burmese politics. The third legacy of British colonialism, because British colonialism had been very exploitative and had left behind a very unequal society, was a left reaction. And so from 1948 onwards, Burmese politics was all about which side of the left you were on, what socialist party you belonged to, or did you belong to the communists? Were you socialist or communist? Which faction of the Communist Party? It was all dominated by the left. In 1989, that ended. The military junta abolished the Burmese way to socialism and said that Burma would from now on be a free market economy. And they took a number of different steps, opening up the country to trade, welcoming investment for the first time, foreign investment for the first time, opening up the tourism sector at that time, privatizing hundreds of state-owned enterprises. And people who had been operating on the margins as black marketeers suddenly were celebrated as national entrepreneurs and welcomed as a new breed of businessmen. Exactly the same time, over those few months, the Communist Party of Burma collapsed. And the Communist Party of Burma insurgency had controlled the northern hills along the Chinese border. They collapsed, the old Marxists ran away to China, and their armies fractured into different ethnic-based insurgent armies, one of which became the United Wa State Army. The Burmese army and the successor armies to the communists signed or agreed to ceasefires that summer of 1989. So that was the second thing that happened. The communists collapsed, and their successor armies, which became ethnic-based militia, agreed to ceasefire. So there was no more fighting in the north. Thirdly, the border with China was thrown open. China had been pushing, because China was also coming out of its isolation in those years in the 80s, for an open border between Yunnan and Myanmar, and this was agreed. And fourthly, these ceasefire groups in the north, like the Wa, and the government basically went into business together. That is the origin of the political economy that we had and we've had in Myanmar over these past 25 years. Illicit industries, especially narcotic drug production, especially heroin production and trafficking, boomed in the 80s. There was massive deforestation in the east of the country for the export of timber to Thailand as well as to China. You had a number of different new industries also developed by the late 1990s, 2000s, like jade, which was estimated to be worth by 2010, 2012 in the billions of dollars every year. Billions of dollars from black money, unregistered money, untaxed money came in to create the new Yangon real estate market and construction sector. And this gave birth to a certain type of capitalism and a certain type of business class in the country, which has had a grip on Burmese society for the past 25 years. People in Burma sometimes talk about the army's economic interests, sometimes talk about cronies and different business cronies, some of whom are more famous than others. People talk sometimes about these illicit industries, but no one's really tried to put it all together into a single frame. And I think the problem is, or not the problem, but I think the way we need to think about this is that over the past 25 years, the institutions of the state, which were never very strong anyway, have weakened further, other than perhaps the army. But the army itself, in some ways, is not the strong institution that some people might think. But what has become extremely strong over these 25 years is this system of money-making and the networks, the rackets that really extend across every racial and religious line in the country, from the very far north to the very far south, and are responsible for multi-billion-dollar industries intimately tied to China, intimately tied to illegal and illicit trade and production. If you look in the last few years, for example, we've seen an entirely new industry develop, and that's the methamphetamine industry, which was not much 10, 15 years ago, but is now estimated by the UN as being worth somewhere over $60 billion a year. Now, even if that is exaggerated, even if that is not true, even half of that is half of the entire official GDP of the country. There was a piece in, I think it was by Reuters, about 3 to 6 months ago, looking at different sources, looking at the methamphetamine trade, and basically discovering that the methamphetamine trade coming out of Myanmar is really controlled by a single drug kingpin, an ethnic Chinese, Canadian Chinese, whose income is believed to be worth, or yearly income is believed to be worth over $15 billion a year. So again, even if those figures are off, even by an order of magnitude, it's an enormous amount of money in Myanmar. And the fact that these networks, these rackets, both legal and illegal, are largely hidden, I think tells us a little bit about the way in which we're missing parts of the bigger picture in the country. But I think on the political economy, I end with some more questions than answers. And I think it's trying to understand this intersection between economics and politics, which is urgently needed in Myanmar. If we go back to what I said in the beginning about sanctions and poverty and humanitarian assistance, Burma is a country which has progressed a lot in many ways, except for people in Rohingya and other people in Rakhine affected by conflict, and some people in the north. But for ordinary people, things are better now than they were 10 years ago. But people are still extremely poor. 10, 20, 30 million people in Burma are some of the poorest people in the world. And it's a much more unequal society than at any time since British rule. But yet no one talks about equality in the country. No one talks about giving content to new democratic institutions through some kind of discussion about what a future economic agenda should be. And I think that this is a core challenge in Myanmar today. Is there a way in which, at a time when democracy is so fragile, is there a way in which new ideas about the political economy and ways in which it can be shaped and changed, is it possible at this stage in Myanmar? And I'll just end by saying that, in Myanmar today, I think you can look at it in one of a couple of different ways. One is that you put all of these different issues on the table, 20 ethnic armed organizations, hundreds of militia, multi-billion-dollar or tens of billions of dollars worth of illicit industries like methamphetamines, weak state institutions, the legacy of military dictatorship, which means that people are extremely uneducated, education systems have atrophied over generations. And then you have on top of that the real effects of climate change, which may be around the corner. And Myanmar is predicted to be one of the 3 or 4 countries most negatively affected by climate change anywhere in the world. And you wonder why the country is even holding together as well as it is right now, right? And so I think you can think of Myanmar as a country which is just on the edge right now, which has made a lot of progress, but unless it makes a lot more progress and gets its act together very soon, it may be in for much harder times still. Or it's possible that we're just missing something still. That we're missing, you go to Yangon, and many of you may have been to Yangon, it's a relatively peaceful place. There are a lot of young people who are extremely motivated to change their country in a good way. You see a lot of good developments in civil society and political parties, even in businesses as well, in terms of reform and businessmen and women wanting to do the right thing. And maybe we're missing something. Maybe there's some other glue, maybe there's some other ingredient that's both holding things together and that's going to see things through. But I think we'll know more in the next few years how things go. But for me, I think the hardest thing in writing this book was trying to decide, whether to end on a relatively optimistic or pessimistic note. And you can judge yourself if you read it in terms of what you think. But let me stop there and see if you have questions. Thank you very much. I think they're coming with the microphone.
In your opinion, does Aung San Suu Kyi understand the situation of the country just like you? And does she really have power? And is she capable?
Yeah, I don't know if she thinks the same way I do, or if she has the same. I think she's put. I think the difference, though, I would say, is that she and a lot of other people in the country, quite understandably, have put a singular focus on political democratic change. This is where they came from. This was the issue around which they had organized. And through no fault of their own, over 20 years, hundreds of people were exiled, hundreds of people were thrown into prison, dozens of people died in prison. So they never really had a chance, or many of them never had a chance to think and debate and travel around the country and come up with different ideas. And even now, I think in 2016, when they finally came into office, they came into office with this very clear focus that the Constitution as it was not democratic and needed to change. And I think the agenda on a wider spectrum of issues really wasn't there. But in many ways, that's the tragedy of the country, because they themselves also didn't have that opportunity to do that until at least 2011, 2012. I think in terms of the power, I think she has a lot of power. I think we have to be clear what the Constitution is. In the current Constitution, the army has 25% of seats in Parliament, which means that it has an effective veto on further constitutional change. So the Constitution cannot change without the army agreeing. But because the NLD has a supermajority, has more than 50% despite the 25% army, it means that it can pass any other law that it wants. So the government's budget, which is about $16 billion a year, the government budget, government spending in general, health, education, trade issues, economic issues, investment, foreign policy, and the general administration department now, which is the local administration department going down to the township, village level, that all reports directly up to the president, which is her appointee. So in the economic and social and foreign policy sectors, she has pretty much complete control.
Just one more question. The drug problem is not only Myanmar problem, it's also the world problem. I have a big question mark for so long. You need raw material. Even the minority army, they need weapon, they need ammunition, they need uniform. Somebody supplying that. Why can't we cut the flow of that?
Yeah, I guess that's a good question. I mean, I think that, as you know, there are many different black markets and gray markets and weapons. I think the uniforms are probably not that difficult. I think in terms of arms, you have both coming out of China, but also out of other countries. You have different black and gray markets in weapons, including quite sophisticated weapons. The Myanmar army recently overran a village in the northeast of the country, in Shan State, belonging to that had been controlled by the TNLA, which is one of the insurgent groups, and they discovered Chinese-made surface-to-air missiles, shoulder-length surface-to-air missiles that can take out a plane, and those were made in China. Exactly how it comes across the border from China, I guess, is anyone's guess. A lot of the precursor chemicals for methamphetamines come from China. Maybe some come from other countries as well, but it's primarily from China. So it's a question in terms of, what is that border, who controls it, how much control can the Chinese central government have, how much of it is being allowed by more local authorities, or does it work in a different way? That's more for a China specialist to judge. But that border is basically completely open. If we think about arms, though, I think the only other point that I would make is that the United Wa State Army, which is again the biggest armed group in the country, and one of the biggest non-state armies anywhere in the world, has its own weapons producing capability as well. They have factories which make light arms and ammunition as well.
And it's quite obvious even to normal citizens that the military basically use their position to benefit from this crony capitalism which you described. And given that they also don't have another ideological platform, how sustainable is their position? I mean, how can they justify still to have this privileged political position if the citizens don't see any benefit from their presence? I'm not sure, but I think that we have to think of a few things. One is that the generals which created the political economy in the 90s, many of whom were super corrupt and made a lot of money as regional commanders in the 1990s, are basically now gone. I mean, they're dead or they're retired and very old. The second generation of generals who ruled the country in the 2000s, basically, some of whom became the ex-generals who were in the last government, they are also, some of them are still active in politics, but many of them are also retired. The current army generals are a new generation of generals, many of whom are, my age, in their late 40s or 50s, and who were not responsible for the system as they grew up, and I think are not really sure what they should want in the future as well. So I don't think we should think of the army as a monolith, but also I think we have to understand that the army has shifted its position and its thinking and is made up of different people now than it was 10 years ago. So I think that's one point. The second is that the army did give up a huge amount of its economic power in 2011 as an institution. The army until 2011 controlled through the Trade Council all import-export. They had a monopoly, for instance, on car imports. Car permits were sold for $100,000, $200,000 and were given out to army officers. They had a monopoly on beer and cigarettes, which they gave up. They began to pay tax, their companies, for example. So the army's footprint on the economy has actually shrunk quite dramatically since 2011. So that would be the second point. I think in terms of the relationship between the army generals, even in the past, and the crony businessmen, basically 40, 50 top businessmen in the country, is a little more complicated. I mean, and I think it differs from person to person, general to general, and businessman to businessman. I think what's clear is across the board, almost all, not all, but almost all of these businessmen owe their wealth and their success to relationship with usually one or maybe a couple of generals. The question is, what did the generals get out of it? And it wasn't necessarily, I don't think, a simple transaction where they set up this business as a shell business led by some crony and then they make a lot of money. I think it's more different. And I think if you look closely, for instance, in the conflict areas, there was a security agenda as well. So in many of these places, nurturing a certain type of business in this new system was also a way of either buying off militia or extending the influence and the authority of the center at a time when the center's institutions were very weak. So you go off and you give a businessman 1,000 acres of land to set up a plantation,
at a time when the state cannot roll out health and education and judicial services or anything else. So it was a part of a state building. The other thing is that I think, the relationship between wealth and power also works in slightly different ways. And I think for some people, it's not just about, for the generals and for office holders, because it's bureaucrats as well, I think it's not so much about necessarily hoarding as much wealth and having as much cash as possible in the bank account. It's been about nurturing a whole network of businesses that basically owe you as a patron, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is it's a complicated and complex set of relationships. And in terms of what happens next, I think within the army, I think amongst ex-generals, I think within that crony or top business class, I think you'll see a whole range of different views in terms of where they think things should be. And that's why Myanmar is at this really delicate moment where I think in the democracy movement, in the army, in the business class, people are not really sure what should happen. And in a way, I think it's a time when new ideas and big ideas can also have a big impact as well.
Thank you very much for your. Sorry.
Hello. Can I ask a question? Wherever you look in the world, very often it's the students who are in the vanguard of opposition to oppression. So I wonder, could you briefly elaborate on your connection with the All Burma Students Democratic Front? That was very interesting for me.
Sure. Well, they're all now, like me, in their 50s, and so they're not really students anymore. But what happened to them was that, at the height, in late 88, 89, there were 10,000 of them. They organized in these camps. They had very little money. They were dependent on the ethnic insurgent groups like the Karen National Union and the New Mon State Party Army at Three Pagodas Pass for their basic survival. And they wanted to fight the Burmese army, and so they wanted training. They tried to get guns. They tried to buy guns in Thailand. They tried to, they went along on patrols with these ethnic insurgent groups. But pretty soon, many of them went home. Some of them were arrested then. Some of them came to Thailand. Some of them became refugees or sought asylum. And so it shrunk after about 5-6 years. And now there's a very small number left, which then officially signed a ceasefire with the government a few years ago. I think in terms of student politics at the center, the army basically decimated crushed the student movement and decimated the education system in the 90s by having schools and universities closed for many years at a time, and basically ending the elite university system in the country. Rangoon University, Mandalay University used to be quite good universities. They were gutted, and the army set up dozens of other small universities to spread out the student population as much as possible. Many academics lost their jobs, many of them were jailed, many of them left the country, and so you really just have a shell of what was a fairly good education system through relative to other Asian countries through the 60s and even 70s.
Dr. Thant, can I ask you, you hinted on some big ideas, big leap that Myanmar would need, otherwise it would trot along like this for another 50 years. Would you entertain the idea that the Thai and Myanmar economies, just the economy part, should merge? Because there are 4 or 5 million Burmese already in Thailand. A little bit like West and East Germany's, but in a way that is only affect the economies in order to leave the labors, the salary, the development. Because if you look at the border areas are the part that most people, the grassroots people are most well off, because they can reap the benefits of this side of the economies. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's one of the biggest untold stories in Myanmar, which I touch on in the book, but actually don't talk about enough. Perhaps is this gigantic west to east migration of people over the past 20 years, which has meant that millions of people from east of Myanmar, Shan State, especially southern Shan State, Karen State, Tenasserim, Mon State, have crossed into Thailand and have become workers in Thailand over the past 20 years. And then their place has been taken by millions of people from the dry zone, very poor ethnic Burmese people from the center of the dry zone, which is one of the poorest places in the country, around Mandalay, Pagan, and further south. We had drought, which led to near famine in 2010. Many of them are people who left at that time. And then after Cyclone Nargis left hundreds of thousands of people without livelihoods, you had a move of people from there also to the east. And then from Rakhine State, you have not just Muslims, Rohingya and others traveling by boat to Thailand and elsewhere, but you have Rakhine Buddhists also going up to Kachin State to work in the jade mines, to work in the cities. So it's a west to east migration, and because migrant labor has been formalized and more or less regularized over the past few years since 2012, you have a fairly integrated labor market in one way, and for a poor Burmese person, if you want to go to Thailand and work, you can. It's not like in the old days where it was technically illegal and very dangerous and difficult. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I mean, in one way it's a good thing, because I think without that you would have a far greater poverty in Myanmar. The remittance economy from Thailand is a huge driver of it's a huge driver of economic activity in the country. You go to villages in Myanmar and the families that have one kid in Thailand are much better off than those who don't. But I think going forward, I don't know what the big ideas are, but I think we should look at all kinds of big ideas I would say three things. One is that I think in Myanmar, what's urgently needed is an agenda against discrimination. There's a lot of discussion in Myanmar about federalism as an outcome of a peace process, but to be honest, I'm a little wary I'm all in favor of local democracy and good local government, but if by federalism we mean ethnically demarcated states, I'm not sure how well that's going to work in the future, because Myanmar is a much more mixed country demographically than it was even 20 years ago. And this is, you go back and you look at the British census records that I mentioned, the British called Burma a zone, and they meant this in a derogatory way, a zone of racial instability, meaning that people weren't sure what they were, and they were changing all the time and intermarrying and moving around. And Burma today, or Myanmar today, is like that. It's much more mixed than it was before. And so I think ethnically demarcating states to belong to one group or another may not be the way forward. But I think a strong anti-discrimination agenda, because you have hundreds of thousands of Kachin and Shan and others living in Rangoon, for example, I think is extremely important. I think secondly, though, I think in Myanmar we need a much more radical vision of what a welfare state in Myanmar could look like. I think it's a poor country, but it's a country that can afford much better services for vulnerable people in the country. I think we need a revolutionary change in our health and education systems, and a massive investment, especially in education. I think we need an almost sort of war footing in terms of an all-government approach to how to overhaul the existing bureaucracies and move education in a new direction. And I think we have to think about how to manage China. I think Thailand is really important as a big economy next door, but China is probably even more important. And how we can just stop playing a defensive game and think about how to take advantage of being next to China is a new idea that's necessary. And then we need urgently as well to think about climate adaptation. And what climate change over the next 10, 20 years is going to mean, and should mean, even now in terms of infrastructure planning and planning for urban city growth and urban development in the country. So I think, I don't disagree with you in terms of thinking about how greater integration between Thailand and Myanmar could work. And I think what's needed, though, and what I would like to do over this coming year or two, is really think much more with other Burmese as well as other people internationally about understanding the political economy as it is more, because I think we have a lot of kind of abstract ideas out there, and I think not enough done in terms of understanding the relationship between power and money in Myanmar. And I think unless one understands the relationship between power and money, any good idea is going to run up against a lot of problems very quickly. I don't know who to call on if... please.
Yes, thank you very much for your illuminating lecture. My name is Maat Raukas, I'm a movie maker. So I agree with you very much that there is an oversimplified narrative in Western media about the Burma, very much so. But you bring in your book a lot of history. And as we know, the term history comes from Greek historia, which means inquiry. So we can learn from history. And if we look how the Western media is describing the situation in Burma, there are mainly the terms like the lack of democracy, not so much openness needed, not knowing the place on international arena, so on and so on. And what these terms are, they're descriptions. To be open or not open is a description. To be democratic or not democratic is a description. And the tricky thing which has happened in media is that these descriptions have become the value statements. So we assume that openness is always good, that democracy is always good. And why I mentioned the history, that we can learn from history. If you go to the Archaeological Museum of Yangon, a great place, you can see just a sheet of a paper. This is a transcript from the letter of a king of Burma, the man called King Aung Lung, I think, yes, Aung Lung, to the English King George II. And in this letter, the Burma's king is basically asking to come and take the country over. And you mentioned the dark era of colonial regime and so on. So maybe we have to learn from the history. We have to learn from the history. And we also need to ask how much openness we need. My question is that how you, yes. Sorry, yes. My question is that how you feel about the letter of King of Burma to George II, which one can see in the Archaeological Museum of Yangon. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I don't think he never received a reply to that. It's interesting because it happened during the French and the War of 1757, French and Indian War in the United States, where there was a civil war in Burma at the same time. The Burmese were in the north of the country. The Mons had a kingdom at Pegu in the south of the country. The English basically supported the Burmese, Long Pia and others. The French from Pondicherry supported the Mons in the south, and the Mons lost. But the French didn't find out until it was too late. And the interesting story in relation to what happened at the end was that a French ship of 300 men from Brittany and Normandy sailed into Rangoon Harbor after the Mons had surrendered, and they didn't know that they were on the losing side. And all the men of the ship were promptly arrested by the Burmese and were marched, or maybe shipped or marched north to a village not far from where Mandalay is today, and their descendants are there today. And so it's a little kind of ending to a French attempt to be involved in Myanmar politics at that time. But the letter that you mentioned was the Burmese king reaching out to the English for support in a civil war, which in the end he didn't. He received some arms from the East India Company, but it may not have been decisive. A couple of more questions, yeah.
You had mentioned that outside and inside Myanmar, there's been a lot of hope, I guess, or projection with Aung San Suu Kyi. And I read your book, and I came away from my sense of what you were saying in there was that she's actually perhaps a little bit of a cipher, or maybe just a very typical politician. In other words, people don't really know. I mean, what she projects or what people think is not really who she is. I'm just wondering if I interpreted that right, that she's not really the person that might be able to bring about the change that a lot of people think or want.
Yeah, I think she's not the person that many people in the West thought that she might be, which was really, I mean, in a way, the Western image was almost an image of a cipher in the sense of someone who was just there as a vessel for Western liberal democratic thinking and ideas about human rights as they were at the time in 1995 or 2000. And I think in the end, she's a very complex person, and I've known her for a long time, and you read the things that she said or wrote about 20 years ago, 10 years ago, what she talks about today, and they go in many different directions, and I think only time will tell in terms of what her exact place in Myanmar history is going to be. But I think whatever it is, it's very clear to me that she is, and I think she feels herself to be a Burmese nationalist first and foremost. And I think the legacy of her father as a nationalist leader is very important to her. I think this idea of the army as an institution that her father created, which has gone off on a wrong track, and she has a historic kind of responsibility or a destiny to kind of bring the army back on track, I think is very important to her. So I think what's important to her is the Myanmar story that I believe she feels she's a part of. And it's fueled by a particular strain of Burmese nationalism. And I think these last few years, and her living up in the capital and experiencing multiple crises together with other Burmese people there, I think it's only reinforced that perspective. So I think whatever other perspectives there may have been, that may have been fresher in the days when she was just a few years from moving from Oxford to Burma, I think those have waned. I think she believes that she is, her mission is to affect this more democratic constitution and bringing the army under an elected leader. And if she manages to do that over these few years, then perhaps history will see her in a certain way. If she doesn't manage to do that, then people might think that there were other roads not taken that might have been worth trying. I think a lot of the criticism of her or the disappointment comes in such different directions. I mean, in the West, it's really 99% about the Rohingya crisis and her handling of that. Within the country, from ethnic minorities, it's much more about a feeling that she has not empathized with them or their struggle and the way in which the peace process has been handled. From businessmen, it's completely different. It's the sense that her government has not put priority on the economy and has not managed the economy well. From Burmese civil society groups, it's about a feeling that she hasn't stood up for protecting the increasing freedom and media freedom that was established in the early part of this decade, and not showing herself to be this strong supporter of basic political freedom. So these are completely different kinds of criticism. But I think we're going into elections in later this year. And perhaps on the exact same day as the US election, so it'll be an interesting 24 hours. But, I think they're very much her parties to lose. I think, despite the disappointment of all those different groups that I just mentioned, I think for the ordinary Burmese person in an average town and village in the country, again, not counting the conflict areas in the West and in the North, the last 10 years have probably been the best 10 years of the last half century. And, in these towns, despite all of the problems, you do see some positive changes. You see local activist groups and others, some affiliated with the NLD, some not, able to take on, poor sanitation or a corrupt judge or improve neighborhood policing or whatever it is. And in the end, they believe that it's her and her sacrifice that have allowed this new situation to emerge. And I think, and many of these same people will say, they've only been in office for 2-3 years and you have to give them more time. So I think there's still this wellspring of good feeling towards her, and I think that's going to carry the election in 2020.
Sorry. Thank you for your presentation. You are quite an apologist for Burma, and probably the kind of person that is really needed. However, I have to say, as a Westerner, the Rohingya crisis, and then there's also hundreds of thousands of people in camps along the Thai-Myanmar border. This is outrageous. You talked about maybe Burma is racist, but this is outrageous. These are real people and their lives. 600,000 and more people forced out, and the people in the camps. I find this is outrageous. I have to say that. I don't know what you can say back, but you can put it in a category. But I think that a lot of the world's outraged.
What was the question then?
Well, how can you answer it? I mean, how can you accept it? What can be done to bring the people back to their legitimate homes so they don't have to live?
You mean Rohingya or on the Thai border?
Pardon?
Do you mean Rohingya or on the Thai border?
Both.
Yeah, on the Thai border, I think it should be relatively easy because we've had a peace process which has been going on. It's not difficult. The negotiations have been difficult for the last few years, but there's at least a chance that the ceasefires in place will lead to some sort of settlement, which means that the refugees on this side can go back. You've had some reintegration of 400,000 IDPs who are on the Myanmar side of the border over the past 5-6 years, but their situation is terrible. But it's not just them. I mean, the situation of poor people, IDPs around the country, everywhere, is awful, which was the main point that I was trying to make. I think with the Rohingya who are in the Bangladesh refugee camps, I don't think we should be under any illusion that people will be able to come back in dignity, honor, security, voluntarily anytime soon. I think that if you look at the constellation of political forces at work on the ground, I think the chances that they will actually want themselves to come back in this situation is extremely remote. I think if you look at the people who are in the camps, I mean, half of them are kids. 400,000 or so out of 700,000 are kids or very young people. They have almost no education in the camps at all. It's a time bomb in terms of their situation. So I think the protection of people in the camps where they are is a #1 priority. I think the second is the situation and protection of vulnerable people in Rakhine State itself, where you have 500,000 or so Muslim different communities, not just Rohingya, Kaman and others, but you also have hundreds of thousands of people displaced from recent fighting, who are from different ethnic communities. You have this new Arakan army insurgency, which has gone from strength to strength over the past couple of years. You have a terrible situation in Rakhine, and I don't have any good ideas in terms of how that can be addressed outside of change in Myanmar as a whole. I don't see any way in which we can carve out and make a tiny part of Myanmar that much better. I think it means systemic change across the entire country. You have tens of millions of vulnerable people everywhere in the country who are getting a raw deal right now. And unless we put in place the dynamics which are going to fix that for all of those people, I just don't see at the margins things improving either in Western Rakhine or in conflict areas in the East as well.
Just a quick comment and then a question. The comment is that, I hear East-West, and I think that's a bit of a false divide. Yes, the so-called Western media bosses are not that interested in the good stories that many journalists actually want to write, and there are quite a few of them who are able and sometimes are allowed to write these kinds of stories, but it's that distortions. But it would never have been possible for the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council to seize the initiative from the inactive, sleeping UN Security Council if there had not been worldwide support for solutions for what I call not the Rohingya crisis, but the Rakhine State crisis. That's one point. My question is more about, I feel for you because it's difficult to find the right time to write a book about Burma. And you must have thought a number of times this year when things were happening, what if? And you just mentioned Rakhine, and that is one of them. But another one is China, and another one is accountability. On China, 2 weeks' time, President Xi Jinping will be there. What should we expect of that visit? Because he doesn't come if he doesn't have a good reason to come. And the other one, I forgot what the other one was, so, but that's quite enough, I think.
Yeah, I worry a little bit, you know, with the UN, that it's a place sometimes, as you know very well, where governments do things not in the real life, but in one way, and then at the UN they vote in a different way. I mean, the UN sometimes is a convenient and cheap place in which to show a certain type of position, and sometimes it's not reflected in how those same governments may act in bilateral relations or in other fora as well. So I think, but I accept your point that it's a very mixed picture in terms, and it's not a solid sort of, I mean, it's certainly not East-West, because you have the whole OIC that is extremely oppositional to Myanmar at the moment. I think in terms of China, it's, you know, it's just it's another huge issue which I don't think there is a overall strategy. I think I guess to be fair to the government in a way, you know, China has been pushing BRI projects in the China-Myanmar Economic Corridor now for a while. I think with China, you know, its number one concern is to prevent the kind of fighting at the border that we saw a few years ago, which led to tens of thousands of refugees crossing the border, fighting spilling over into the Chinese side. I think that's their number one red line. I think secondly, though, I think the Chinese were extremely anxious about what they saw as a Western-funded and Japanese-funded peace process that I was involved in 2011 to 2015, and which they thought might lead to some kind of ceasefire and peace settlement that would bring Western governments, NGOs, UN people right up to their border. And I think they have pushed back against that situation and created a situation where they are the only outside actor really involved and indispensable to the peace process going forward. I think the infrastructure projects are important to China, but I don't think all of the different infrastructure projects are necessarily that. I mean, Myanmar as an economic entity is a drop in the ocean for China. And even the kind of access to the sea and things, people make a lot of it, but I'm not sure it's that important for China to have right now. I think what's important for China is that they feel they have a window of opportunity, that because of the Rakhine crisis, relations with the West are on a back foot, and that they want to create a certain situation where China locks in its position as Myanmar's top friend. And I think they feel that they have the opportunity to do that. So it might be in terms of the number of deals that are signed over the coming week or two. It could be something else, but I think they feel that the timing is right, and I think Beijing has also been very actively preparing for a major celebration of the 70th anniversary of PRC Myanmar relations this autumn as well.
Okay, please ask. Yeah, quick question. In 2015-16, I was repeatedly visiting Myanmar, and when I went to like the Rotary Club and so on, I noticed a very positive aspect. There was a kind of a brain flow back. A lot of people in the professionals in their 30s and 40s who had once upon a time given up almost on their country were coming back with new optimistic expectations, particularly prior to the last election. But since then, I got the sense there's a great amount of possible disappointment. As you mentioned, that too much was put on the shoulders of Aung San Suu Kyi. And my question would be is, since all these expectations from various sectors of Myanmar have been placed on one, let's put it frankly, elderly woman who could momentarily, suddenly drop out of the scene physically or mentally, how vulnerable is the state with so much riding on one frail woman's shoulders?
Yeah, that's a good question, because it goes to a little bit of what I was saying before. You know, is this situation where there's actually a lot of other things that are holding things together? The situation is terrible in Rakhine, situation is terrible in the Northeast, but for a lot of the rest of the country, it's relatively peaceful. Are we missing things that we're not seeing in terms of weak institutions? Or is it the case that things could tip over and perhaps someone like, you know, just Aung San Suu Kyi, whatever you say about her and however critical, she's one of the pieces that's kind of holding things together, and if she's not there, it won't. I don't know. It's very hard for me to imagine the National League for Democracy surviving without her in its present form, because she is so much the dominant person and figure that it really has centralized a lot of power there. And then you have the army, and then it's a question of what the army's capacity would be to kind of play a stabilizing role if that's what it would have to do in that situation. My guess is that, if I had to guess, I would say that, you know, it's going to be like now in the future, in the sense that there'll be parts of the country that are extremely badly off, and then you'll have pockets of progress. You'll have some people who do very well. You'll have, you know, within earshot of millions of people who are not. I think you'll have an extremely mixed picture, and whether that leads to the whole thing again falling apart into something much worse or not, I guess it's difficult to say. But yeah, I think, you know, the story so far has been one where she has moved into this paramount position very clearly, whatever the Constitution says and everything else. And so, you know, I think if she, you know, her party wins the election in 2020, I think a huge issue will be in 2021. Do we start to see anything significant or different in terms of succession planning, and will new people emerge from within the NLD? So the deputy leader of the NLD, at sort of the party boss below her, is the chief minister of Mandalay, but he was a little bit younger than her, but not that much. But he was recently diagnosed with leukemia, and has been out of action for a few months. So it's not really clear who would be the person that she might put up there as her deputy if she begins to take a step back, as she has said that she might. Maybe one last, or no, that's fine.
What about your self-involvement?
I'm sorry?
What about your self-involvement in Myanmar politics?
Yeah, I don't plan to join any political party. No. Right.
Dr. Thant, thank you very much for a wonderful lecture. I'd just like... I'd like to share with the audience one other aspect of Dr. Thant's life. He mentioned that as a teenager growing up, he came here to the Siam Society. But the Siam Society is now going to be working with him in another role in Yangon, which he didn't mention this evening. One of his achievements there is a few years ago to set up the Yangon Heritage Trust, which has been extraordinarily successful in raising consciousness among the government and the people in Yangon about the importance of preserving the old colonial architectural heritage of the city. And the Yangon Heritage Trust has now joined with the Siam Society and 5 other civil society organizations in ASEAN to start an ASEAN Heritage Alliance. So we look forward to working with you and maybe having you come back and speak on that subject next time. Thank you very much.